While central bankers stand before cameras assuring stability, their vaults tell a different story. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of England spent 2023 and 2024 delivering carefully crafted messages about transitory challenges and controlled normalization. But behind those podiums, their institutions were accumulating physical gold at a pace not seen in over half a century. Between 2022 and 2024, central banks added 1,136 tons of gold annually to their reserves, the fastest accumulation rate since 1967. These aren't small purchases hidden in footnotes, but massive movements of physical metal into domestic vaults, happening while officials publicly emphasize digital systems, modern monetary tools, and the stability of existing arrangements. Once you notice it, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Jerome Powell testified before Congress in March 2023 that the banking system remained sound and resilient. Yet that same quarter, the Federal Reserve increased discount window lending by over 300% compared to the previous year. Christine Lagarde spent 2024 highlighting the ECB's successful inflation management while simultaneously and quietly expanding its collateral acceptance criteria to include lower quality assets. The Bank of England spoke about normalization while maintaining emergency purchase facilities on permanent standby. This pattern appears across every major central bank, public reassurance paired with private defensive positioning, creating a gap between words and actions that keeps widening. But there's something more specific happening here that goes beyond random institutional anxiety. The preparation follows a blueprint, with the gold accumulation, emergency facilities, and coordinated infrastructure all mapping to a specific historical moment. Central banks are preparing for what they believe will be a repeat of 1931, though not the version taught in economics courses, but rather the version they study in closed-door briefings. They remember 1931 differently than historians describe it, and that difference explains everything they're doing right now. The public story of 1931 focuses on bank failures and economic collapse, but the institutional story focuses on something far more specific, a structural vulnerability that destroyed the global monetary system in a matter of months. Central banks today believe that vulnerability exists again, and their actions reveal they're preparing for the same mechanism to trigger, planning to respond before the public realizes what's happening. Understanding what actually happened in 1931 reveals why today's central banks are moving billions into physical gold, while assuring everyone the system has never been stronger. The textbooks focus on the wrong catastrophe when they describe 1931. Most accounts center on the Credit-Anstalt collapse in Vienna during May of that year, treating it as the spark that ignited a continental banking crisis. But that collapse was a symptom, not the cause, and central banks today understand the distinction with uncomfortable clarity. The actual mistake happened months before Credit-Anstalt's doors closed, embedded in the architecture of how central banks managed their gold reserves during the late 1920s. European central banks had developed an elegant solution to a persistent problem. They needed to maintain the appearance of substantial gold backing for their currencies while also supporting each other through the perpetual liquidity strains of the post-war reconstruction period. Their solution was a web of collateralized gold lending arrangements between institutions. The Bank of England would lend gold to the Reichsbank, which would use that gold as reserve backing while simultaneously lending to the Austrian National Bank, which counted the same physical metal as part of its own reserves. On paper, each institution appeared adequately capitalized with proper gold ratios backing their currency. The mathematics worked perfectly under one critical assumption: that confidence would remain stable enough that depositors and foreign creditors would never simultaneously demand conversion to physical gold. When confidence broke in May 1931, the illusion shattered in weeks. Depositors across Austria, Germany, and Central Europe began demanding physical gold or hard currency conversion, and the cascade revealed what central bankers already knew but hoped would never be tested. The same gold bars sitting in London vaults backed the British pound, the German mark, and the Austrian shilling simultaneously through layers of collateralized lending. The reserves weren't missing, but they couldn't be in three places at once when everyone demanded them together. The real mistake wasn't the lending arrangements themselves, but the belief that crisis communication could move faster than capital flight in an interconnected system. By the time central banks coordinated their response and arranged emergency credit lines through the newly operational Bank for International Settlements, currency markets had already priced in the insolvency. By September, Britain abandoned the gold standard entirely, and the global monetary framework that had governed international trade since the 1800s collapsed. The mathematics didn't work, and by the time they realized it, the system had already failed. The collapse taught a lesson, just not the right one. In the aftermath of 1931, central banks and international financial institutions conducted extensive reviews of what went wrong, and their conclusion shaped every crisis response mechanism built over the following 9 decades. They determined that the problem was insufficient coordination and communication control between national central banks, not the systemic overleverage created by their interconnected gold lending. This interpretation led directly to the empowerment of the Bank for International Settlements, which had been established in 1930 but became operational just as the 1931 crisis unfolded. The BIS was designed explicitly to coordinate central bank responses during the next crisis, providing a permanent institutional channel for the kind of emergency cooperation that had failed to materialize quickly enough in 1931. Central bankers believed that if they could coordinate faster and communicate more effectively, they could prevent confidence from breaking in the first place. The Basel Accords that followed established frameworks for mutual support and coordinated reserve requirements, creating the architecture for central banks to back each other during liquidity crises. But these frameworks were built on the same flawed assumption that had doomed the 1931 response, that coordinated institutions could outrun capital flight once it began, that communication and cooperation could move faster than market panic. This same coordination model appears in every modern crisis response. The central bank swap lines activated during 2008 allowed the Federal Reserve to provide dollar liquidity to foreign central banks, preventing the kind of cascading currency crisis that destroyed the system in 1931. During 2020, those swap lines expanded again, with coordinated interventions happening within days rather than months. Each time, the coordination worked, and each time, central banks validated their interpretation of the 1931 lesson. They thought the problem was coordination speed, but they missed the structural flaw. Every mechanism they built assumes the next crisis will be manageable through coordinated response, that institutional cooperation can contain market dynamics once confidence breaks. The possibility that the underlying fragility might overwhelm even perfect coordination never entered their institutional playbook. Understanding their interpretation of 1931 explains their current behavior, particularly the growing gap between what central banks say publicly and what they're actually doing with monetary policy and reserve management. This divergence has become more pronounced since 2022, creating a pattern that appears across every major monetary authority. In March 2023, Jerome Powell testified before the Senate Banking Committee that the banking system remained sound and resilient, emphasizing the strength of capital buffers and the effectiveness of post-2008 regulatory frameworks. During that same quarter, the Federal Reserve increased discount window lending by over 300% compared to the previous year, extending emergency credit lines to regional banks at levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The public message emphasized stability, while the actual lending operations revealed institutions scrambling for liquidity. The European Central Bank followed a similar pattern throughout 2024, with official communications highlighting successful inflation management and the controlled trajectory toward price stability targets. But simultaneously, and with far less fanfare, the ECB expanded its collateral acceptance criteria to include lower quality assets, effectively loosening the standards for what banks could pledge in exchange for emergency funding. This change appeared in technical policy updates rather than press conferences, creating a two-tier communication strategy where reassurance dominated public channels, while defensive measures advanced through bureaucratic channels. The Bank of England maintained this same contradiction between 2023 and 2024, with officials repeatedly discussing normalization and the gradual unwinding of pandemic-era emergency measures. Yet the emergency purchase facilities established during prior crises remained on permanent standby, with infrastructure and authorization frameworks kept active rather than dismantled. The word temporary appeared frequently in official descriptions, but the facilities themselves became permanent features of monetary architecture. China's People's Bank took a different approach to the same pattern by reducing transparency rather than contradicting itself openly. The PBOC shifted its dollar reserve disclosure from monthly to quarterly reporting while simultaneously accelerating its gold accumulation to levels that made it the world's largest central bank buyer. Less frequent reporting meant less scrutiny of the reserve composition changes happening underneath. The pattern repeats everywhere: expansive reassurance publicly, defensive positioning privately. When this appears once, it's prudence. When it appears across every major central bank simultaneously, it's preparation. But words and policy adjustments are surface level. The real preparation runs deeper. Central banks aren't just adjusting policies or tightening communication strategies. They're systematically acquiring specific categories of assets that reveal their actual concerns about systemic stability. The pattern becomes clear when you examine not just the volume of accumulation, but the strategic logic behind each category they're prioritizing. Physical gold accumulation represents the most visible and substantial shift in central bank behavior. Between 2022 and 2024, central banks added more than 3,300 tons of gold to their reserves, a 3-year accumulation that exceeds most historical periods by a factor of 3 or more. But the volume alone doesn't tell the complete story. What matters more is where that gold is being stored and who's moving it. Poland, Hungary, and Germany continued withdrawing gold from storage facilities at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Bank of England, repatriating hundreds of tons to newly expanded domestic vault facilities. This reverses decades of practice where smaller European central banks kept their gold reserves in London and New York for convenience and presumed security. The shift to domestic storage carries a clear implication. Physical proximity matters when confidence in the international system becomes questionable. Beyond gold, central banks have been quietly increasing their exposure to strategic resource assets, particularly those linked to energy and agricultural commodities. These positions don't appear as direct commodity holdings, but rather as securities and instruments tied to resource production and distribution networks. The logic mirrors the gold accumulation. These are assets with intrinsic value that maintain worth independent of currency valuations or financial system stability. The development of central bank digital currencies represents a different kind of accumulation, focused on control mechanisms rather than intrinsic value. CBDCs aren't primarily about innovation or payment efficiency despite the public framing. They're about maintaining monetary control when traditional transmission mechanisms fail. Every major central bank now has active CBDC development programs, with infrastructure designed for rapid deployment rather than gradual rollout. Each acquisition answers a specific failure mode they're anticipating. Gold provides value preservation when currency systems face revaluation. Resource exposure maintains purchasing power for essential imports during monetary system transitions. CBDCs ensure policy transmission continues even when commercial banking infrastructure becomes unreliable. The common thread running through all of it is independence from dollar-dominated financial architecture. In 1931, distance from gold meant vulnerability when the crisis accelerated. They've learned that lesson, and they're ensuring physical control over the assets they believe will matter most when the current system faces its test. Individual preparation suggests individual concern, but coordinated preparation suggests shared knowledge. The gold accumulation and policy adjustments happening across central banks would be noteworthy if they occurred in isolation, but they're happening simultaneously through institutional channels designed specifically to coordinate responses away from public scrutiny. The Bank for International Settlements hosts bi-monthly meetings of central bank governors at its headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, gatherings that bring together the heads of every major monetary authority for discussions that produce no published minutes, no official agendas, and no public record of what's actually discussed. These meetings happen openly. The attendance is acknowledged, the dates are known, but their substance remains entirely private, creating a space where central bankers can coordinate strategy without market-moving disclosure. The 2023 Jackson Hole Economic Symposium followed a similar pattern, with public sessions featuring carefully prepared speeches about inflation dynamics and monetary policy transmission, while private breakout sessions covered what internal agendas described as unconventional contingency frameworks. Those private discussions never appeared in official symposium summaries or Federal Reserve transcripts, But participants from multiple central banks attended sessions focused explicitly on crisis preparation scenarios. The International Monetary Fund conducts its special drawing rights allocation discussions through closed sessions that happen months before any public proposals emerge. The 2024 discussions about expanding SDR capacity and allocation mechanisms took place in private meetings between IMF staff and G7 finance ministers, with the substance of those conversations remaining confidential even as general policy directions eventually appeared in public statements. G7 finance minister meetings have increasingly featured separate financial stability sessions that occur outside the official communiqué process. These sessions bring together not just ministers, but central bank deputies and BIS representatives, creating coordination opportunities that bypass public reporting requirements while still maintaining institutional formality. These meetings happen publicly, but their substance remains private. The coordination exists through channels designed specifically to avoid the kind of disclosure that could trigger the very market dynamics they're preparing to manage. Coordination without transparency suggests preparation without public consent, and that combination reveals how seriously they're taking the threat they see coming. Coordination reveals strategy, and strategy reveals the expected threat. The accumulation patterns, policy adjustments, and institutional coordination documented across the previous chapters aren't random defensive measures. They map to a specific crisis sequence that central banks believe is approaching, one that follows the 1931 blueprint but adapted to modern financial architecture. The preparation pattern suggests they're expecting a dollar liquidity crisis to serve as the triggering event, something that would strain the awe of foreign institutions and governments to access dollar funding for international trade and debt service. Unlike 1931, where each nation's crisis unfolded sequentially as confidence broke country by country, the modern response architecture is designed for synchronized intervention through established swap lines and special drawing rights allocation. When the liquidity strain reaches critical levels, the Federal Reserve would activate swap lines with foreign central banks exactly as it did in 2008 and 2020, providing dollar funding to prevent cascading defaults. Simultaneously, the IMF would authorize SDR allocations to supplement reserves, creating additional international liquidity, without requiring congressional approval or public debate. These mechanisms already exist and have been tested multiple times, making them the first line of coordinated response. But the gold accumulation suggests central banks see this initial response as temporary stabilization rather than permanent solution. The endgame their preparation reveals involves currency revaluation against commodity backing, particularly gold, as a way to reset the system after the initial crisis response buys time. This explains why they're accumulating physical gold domestically rather than relying on gold certificates or foreign storage. When revaluation happens, physical possession determines which institutions control the value. Central bank digital currency infrastructure is positioned as the crisis deployment option that enables this transition, providing governments with direct monetary policy transmission that doesn't rely on commercial banking systems that might be impaired during the crisis. The CBDCs aren't being rolled out gradually because they're not intended for gradual adoption. They're being prepared for emergency deployment when existing payment systems face strain. The timeline indicators appear in the shift from accumulation to deployment positioning. Currently, central banks remain in accumulation phase with gold purchases continuing and CBDC infrastructure still in testing. But when gold buying accelerates further, when CBDC programs shift from pilots to full infrastructure build-out, and when emergency facilities transition from standby to active preparation, the crisis window opens. The sequence reveals itself through their preparations, and right now, those preparations indicate they're still building capacity rather than preparing for imminent deployment. Knowing what's coming matters less than knowing when to watch. Central banks will prepare for months or even years before any crisis becomes publicly apparent, and that preparation gap creates an information advantage for anyone willing to monitor the right signals systematically. The observable indicators fall into three distinct categories: acceleration, consolidation, and communication shift. Each category reveals a different dimension of institutional preparation, and together they provide a framework for reading central bank behavior before it translates into market crisis. Acceleration signals appear when existing preparation patterns intensify beyond their established baseline. If central banks have been adding 1,100 tons of gold annually, And that pace suddenly jumps to 1,500 or 2,000 tons. That acceleration indicates timeline compression. When gold repatriation requests multiply beyond the gradual pace seen since 2022, when CBDC programs shift suddenly from limited pilots to full infrastructure build-out, these accelerations reveal changed institutional assessment of how much time remains before deployment becomes necessary. Consolidation signals emerge when coordination mechanisms become more formal and visible despite their sensitive nature. Watch for expansion of IMF or BIS operational roles, for G7 finance track meetings increasing from quarterly to monthly frequency, for new multilateral facilities being established through international agreements. These consolidation moves indicate that preparation is transitioning from individual institutional action to coordinated deployment readiness. Communication signals appear most subtly, but often provide the earliest warning. The shift happens in language rather than policy, when central bank statements move from emphasizing stability to emphasizing resilience, when officials begin highlighting tools available rather than conditions stable. This linguistic transition reveals institutions preparing public expectations for intervention while maintaining the appearance of control. The advantage these signals provide comes from a simple reality. Institutional preparation creates observable footprints that precede public crisis declaration by months. Central banks cannot accumulate thousands of tons of gold secretly. They cannot coordinate through BIS and IMF channels without leaving documentation. They cannot shift communication strategy without creating patterns in official statements. History validates this monitoring approach. In 1931, insiders who watched central bank gold movements and cross-border reserve flows had a 4 to 6 month advantage over public awareness of the systemic crisis. During 2008, observers tracking Federal Reserve balance sheet expansion and emergency facility creation saw the preparation months before Lehman Brothers collapsed. Between March and August 2024, 3 distinct acceleration signals appeared in central bank gold purchases, CBDC infrastructure expansion, and BIS meeting frequency, all visible in public data releases and official reports. These signals are public information, just rarely connected into coherent pattern recognition. Central banks publish balance sheets, gold reserve updates, and policy statements. The BIS releases quarterly reports. IMF meetings have official schedules even when their agendas remain private. The information exists openly. What's missing is the framework to interpret institutional behavior systematically. The crisis will be public. The preparation is already visible. Central banks remember 1931 as the crisis that broke without warning, catching institutions and markets completely unprepared. They're ensuring they'll have warning next time, so can you. Understanding institutional behavior isn't about panic. It's about reading the same information they're acting on, just with open eyes.